Hello, how's it going, everybody? Today we are looking at ancient Greek government and US connections. Now, I know some of you are saying, oh, government. Yeah, some people don't like government, but the reality is it's all around us. It's how we operate, it's how things move. We wouldn't have roads, we wouldn't have schools. There wouldn't be safety concerns in McDonald's, so that really gross person didn't need to wear a hairnet or wash their hands, those kind of things. All those things are great, and we love that we have some of these things in place to make sure that we're protected and we have the services we need, like water, electricity, all those things. So we're going to look at ancient Greece and look at how their government operated and then compare it to the United States to see what's similar and what's different. Now, if you're watching this from home, you most likely in Google Classroom have a note sheet that is already filled out, but there are some sections where you need to answer questions. If you are watching this in school, um, you'll have to fill in the notes as you go along, and you'll see the spots to fill those in. So feel free to stop at any time if you need to, rewind if you need to, do whatever needs to be done to be able to complete what you're doing. So here we go. So Greece is broken up into what are called city-states, and each of these city-states had their own power. So the big question I guess we really should ask ourselves is why? Why would you have all these city states? Why not just simply have one big country? Just say, hey, all that's going to be one country. Well, they didn't do that. Instead, Delphi is a country, Corinth is a country, city state, sorry. Athens is a city state, Olympia is a city state, Sparta is a city state. So it's hard to say, city state. So the big question is, why not have one big government? If you had one big government, you could control everything together, you could work together, you can make it happen. So why? Well, sometimes it's as simple as geography. So let's start with geography. If we take a look at our map here, there's a few things to notice. If you look here, this tells you how high in elevation areas are. So you'll notice that Greece is very mountainous. There's a lot of mountains all over the place. And a city like Olympia over here, while it's not very far away from Sparta, there's a dramatic amount of mountains between them. And so mountains make things difficult, obviously, for movement, for travel, for transportation, and those kind of things. You also have a lot of islands, and you can imagine what that would be like to try to have one government with islands everywhere. And so that becomes an issue as well, is that not only do you have mountains separating people, but you also have people on islands. And how do you make sure the same rules apply to everybody? That's really tricky. If you think about the United States, we have Hawaii, which is an island, but that wasn't until the mid 1900s. Having that as part of our country in the 1700s would have been very difficult. It could have taken weeks to get information back and forth, and that just certainly wasn't going to work. So we're talking BC, thousands of years ago with ancient Greece. And so those mountains and also the water really prevented that sharing of information, but also government from being one. So you have all these city states, and we're going to look at two specifically, a little bit more in detail, a little bit, Athens and Sparta. And they were very different from one another. So a city state is the following. Okay, it's also called a polis. Sometimes you'll hear of polis as well. It's in some of our words we know, like a metropolis, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, lots of different things like that. A polis or city-state is the following. It is the city, the surrounding countryside, and the villages. And usually within that area, you'll have an acropolis, which is like a hilltop. Back in this day, if you wanted to be protected, you needed height, because we're talking about swords and shields and bows and arrows and those kind of things. So if you had a high hilltop, that was a really great place to protect yourself, because you could shoot down on the enemy and they'd have to attack an elevated position, which puts them at a bad disadvantage. Usually you had an agora, which is a public center and marketplace. It's kind of like their malls of the day that you could go to. There's all kinds of city states, and like we said, the two most famous ones are Athens and Sparta. We'll look at that in a second. So here's an example of a city state. You have that acropolis up here, that higher point, and you can imagine if there were a battle or something like that, everybody might first go into the city walls and then go fall back to the Acropolis, because on that hillside it's so hard to attack. But these dotted lines show you the whole city state. It's the little villages, it's the countryside, it is the walled area of the bigger city as well, all together. So that's what we see for a city state. Or polis, same thing. Okay, this is kind of a look at the Acropolis, the top. You have your Acropolis here, your highest point up on the hilltop, and below you have the rest of the city. Usually you'd have a wall around both of these if you could. Here's the Agora, it's like an outdoor marketplace. And there's the actual Acropolis in Athens you can go see today. You can see how hard it would be to get up to those higher points because of the hills and the walls and all that. So if Ellsworth were a polis, if Ellsworth were a city-state, what might you have? Well, here's an idea. Okay, so first off, you'd have your main city, which would be Ellsworth. You'd have smaller population areas surrounding the main city. So areas like Beldenville, Lawton, El Paso, Trimble. I love Google Maps. It seems like, they have actual cities, but then they name bars as part of our towns in this area too, which is funny. So you'd have all that together, plus the surrounding countryside. So the polis or city-state of Ellsworth includes all of this, with Ellsworth at the center, that kind of thing. And actually Ellsworth would fit at the center. We have a higher elevation. We could fortify that, those kind of things. So in our world today, that's what it could be. So the city-state is kind of similar to our school districts as well. You kind of have your middle city, and then you have the other areas that are around it that are affected by it, or people go to, or like a county seat, something like that as well. So they ran with city-states, and that worked for them. And part of the reason it worked for them is that people were very different in different areas. And we know that too. If you go to the Twin Cities, life is very different than it is in Ellsworth. If you go to Elmwood, life's a little different than it is in Ellsworth too. Well, these city-states were different as well. If you look at Sparta had kings, and they focused on military training. It was said that kids at age 7 were sent off to military school, where they're treated very harshly. They're taught to steal. Weaker babies were killed, those kind of things. On the other hand, you have Athens, and Athens was all about education and civilization and all those kind of things. And so they had temples to the gods and statues, and Sparta thought that was a joke. They thought everything should be put towards military training, that kind of thing. So very different places. And part of that is because of the geographical differences. Sparta's in the mountains. Athens is more towards the sea. And so while Athenians are focused on trading with other areas, fishing, that kind of things, Spartans are more, just getting the food that they need from the area around them, and not as big with trading and those kind of things. So city-states were very different depending on where you were. Cool. So types of government in ancient Greece. Before that, if you are doing the online version, the question you had is, imagine the United States was made up of city-states today. We have no national government. So we just have city-states all over the place, like thousands of them. Would that work today? Why or why not? I know the answer. I hope you all know as well. So Greek government, there were 4 different main types of government that you saw in ancient Greece at different time periods. So here's what we have. First off, we have the monarchy. A monarchy is a situation where you have a king or a queen ruling. Power is passed down throughout the family throughout time. So if I'm a king, my son will take over as king when I die, so on and so forth. Next, we have tyranny, a tyrant. One person seizes all power, usually by using military force. And this person has complete control of that area. And maybe they use that complete control to make life miserable. Maybe they try to make people happy so other tyrants don't come and kill them. But it's one person in charge. Third, an oligarchy. You have a small group rules over the city-state. And it's often wealthy landowners, something called an aristocracy. And so these wealthy landowners are the ones in charge of that city-state. So sometimes we see an oligarchy where it's a group instead of one person that's in charge. And fourth, democracy. We know democracy. Rules and decisions are made by the citizens for the people, or the citizens vote for other people that make rules for them. So these are your four different types that we have in ancient Greece, and we still see some of these today. So the big question is, which would you prefer? A monarchy where power is held in a family line, tyranny where one person rules, oligarchy where a small group of people rule, or democracy where all people share power. So take a second to think about that. Which ones do you think are the best? Which ones are the worst? If you had to choose one, which group would you choose? So moving forward, we have two types of democracies that we see in ancient Greece starting out, and now they've completely formed in the United States in many different ways. We have direct democracy and indirect, or as we know it, representative democracy. So first off, direct democracy. Government is ruled directly by the citizens. The citizens themselves vote on issues, and the group with the majority wins. Individuals play a major role in nearly all decisions. So if you think about Ellsworth, if we had direct democracy, we would be voting on everything. So let's say Culver's wants to come into town. Yum. We would vote. All the citizens would vote if they want to allow Culver's to come in. If we are looking at putting in a new sewer system, all the citizens would vote. If we have to decide how we're going to use our money for roads and which roads we're going to pave, all the citizens decide. It'd be a lot of situations where citizens have to vote on things, which would be very different than what we know with our representative democracy that we have. So think for a second, does this seem like this would be best for big areas or small areas? Where would you see direct democracy working best? If you said small, you're correct. It's really hard for direct democracy to work with lots of people because there's so many opinions, and how do you get them all together in one place, things like that. And so a lot of times when you see direct democracy in the United States, it's with smaller groups making decisions and not necessarily the whole country. The kind of government we see the most in the United States is representative democracy, government ruled by elected officials. So we, the people, vote for our representatives, whether it be the president, a senator, a judge, a sheriff, or whatever it might be, somebody at the national, state, or local level, and they run the government. And so when we choose a senator or representative, they're working for us, and they're supposed to be looking out for our interests. And so when they vote on laws, they think about, all right, how would the people in Wisconsin or how would the people in Western Wisconsin feel about this? And then they make decisions based on that. That's what you hope for. And so we don't make all the decisions ourselves. These elected representatives do. So I gave you a few examples there. Another example would be school board. When you elect a school board member, they are representing you. So when all the decisions were made about should we go in person to school with coronavirus, should we stay at home, school board members chose that, and they were chosen in an election by the people. So best for big or small areas? Think about it. The answer is kind of both. Representative democracy works really good in a small town like Ellsworth, but it also works really good in the United States. So you can use this a little bit more at both levels. So the question, if you're doing the online notes, is why does it make sense that the United States uses more representative democracy than direct democracy? So think about, why would this type work better for our country than if we would vote on everything ourselves? So moving forward, a few examples, take your pick. Which one do you think it is? Voting on a school referendum. Voting to decide, for example, if Ellsworth should be given the funding through taxes for a new elementary school. Is that direct democracy or representative? The answer is direct, because you are directly making that choice yourself. You're not voting for a person who's going to make that decision. Voting for a school board member. That is representative democracy, because you are choosing somebody else who will represent you. Voting for the president. People get tricked in this one. This is representative as well, because you're choosing somebody who's going to represent you. You're not making the choices. You're choosing somebody else who will. This is a while ago. Colorado citizens voting on if marijuana should be legalized in their state. That was an example of direct democracy because they were choosing yes or no for this issue. All right, if you're at a town hall meeting, you're voting to make a new regulation or rule for your city at that meeting. If it's normal citizens voting, that'd be direct democracy because you're choosing yourselves. And voting for a state senator, that is representative democracy because they are representing you and making laws on your behalf. So there you have it, direct and representative democracy. All right, voting rights. Very different in ancient Greece. Maybe. It says this, only citizens could vote. Now, most Americans would agree with that. They think that's a great idea. Only citizens should have the right to vote. Well, there's kind of a catch here, and here's the catch. Only free adult males could be citizens, which means a few things. Number one, ancient Greece had slavery. Slaves couldn't vote. And number two, women couldn't vote either. And so while it sounds good, only citizens could vote, only certain people could be citizens in Greece. So think for a second, how does that differ from the United States? It obviously is very different in terms of citizenship and who is a citizen, who's not. Now, I think it's important as well to think about how voting has changed in the United States because we haven't always been a place where everybody can vote. That has changed over time. So we're going to take a look on this website here. We'll see if it loads okay for us. And we're going to look specifically at voting rights and how they've changed over time. So here we go. All right, we'll begin. 1789, that's a little too big. With the signing of the Constitution of the United States, the rights to vote is extended to white property owning men. So think about this. When we have the Constitution as our government, so this is pretty close to the beginning of the United States, you could only vote if you are white and you own property and you were male. That was the start. So think about how much things have changed since then, that it's not just white property owning males anymore. So that's our first one. Let's move on to our next one. We'll delete that. All right. So let's go to 1828. Maryland becomes the last state to remove religious restrictions. States can no longer deny eligible voters the right to vote on the basis of religion. So we see in 1828, before then, if you were the wrong religion, they could prevent you from voting. So if I would go into an area that's Puritan and I'm Catholic, I don't even get the right to vote. That's crazy. Obviously today it does not matter what religion it is. If they tried to stop you from voting because of your religion, that'd be absolutely illegal. So thankfully that's changed. 1856, North Carolina becomes the last state to eliminate property requirements for voting purposes. So it's not until 1856, we're talking over 50 years. Let's see here, 75 years since our country became brought in, basically. It took that long to say, hey, you know what? Maybe you should be able to vote if you don't own property. Before this, even if you were a white male, you couldn't vote without property. So kind of crazy. Okay, on to 1870. The 15th Amendment. The right to vote is extended to all male citizens regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Thank goodness. 1870, we have the Civil War is over, and this extends the right to vote to men that are both white or black. It does not matter what race you are, you have the right to vote. However, you'll notice it's still for only men. Women still don't have the right to vote. In 1915, this is extended further. The grandfather clause is struck down. Basically, the grandfather clause said if your grandfather could not vote prior to, I think it was like 1867 or something like that, you don't have the right to vote. Basically, what it did is it made it impossible for African Americans to vote because all of their grandfathers couldn't vote because they had been slaves before that time. And so Southern states specifically did whatever they could to stop African Americans from voting. And the grandfather clause was one thing they did. Well, 1915, this court case, the Supreme Court says, no, that's not fair. That's not right. You can't do that. So that's gone. Goodbye. Wonderful. On to 1920. This is a big one, the 19th Amendment. After World War I, women are really pushing for the right to vote, and they get it. So finally, in 1920, you have men can vote, women can vote, and people of different skin colors can vote. Took a long time to get there, but we did it. That's a good thing. However, it wasn't until 1924 that most Native Americans gained the right to vote. A lot of Native Americans were not considered citizens, and therefore they weren't given the right to vote. In 1924, it was declared that all Native Americans born in the U.S., even if they're on Native property, are citizens and they have the right to vote. So women gained the right to vote before any Native Americans had the right to vote, which is interesting, I think at least. 1964, you have the 24th Amendment, which outlawed poll taxes. Another way they tried to stop African Americans from voting, primarily in the South, is they had poll taxes. You'd have to pay a tax to vote. And a lot of African Americans were pretty poor at the time, and so they couldn't afford that, so they didn't vote. Well, in 1964, it was decided that that is illegal. You have to give all people the right to vote, regardless of whether they can pay a tax. On to the 26th Amendment, 1971. Okay, this extends the right to vote to all people 18 years of age or older. Before this, some states had 19 years of age to vote. I think some states had 21 as well. And so now they decided the age is 18. And that was a popular move because, you know, we're in the Vietnam War era, and you have 18-year-olds going off to fight, and some are dying for their country, and they can't even vote yet in some places. So this gives more people the right to vote. And finally, 1990, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and part of that made sure that all places for voting, polling sites, have everything necessary so that people that are disabled can vote. And so that might be making it so that they can have a ramp if there's stairs. It may be giving them a bigger voting booth so that they can get in with a wheelchair, or other technology. Maybe it's hearing accessibility so they can hear who the different candidates are, all those kind of things. So lots of things that got us to the point we're at today. It wasn't easy. Some of these things were very difficult to pass, but we've changed a lot. Think about ancient Greece. You know, you had to be male and you couldn't be a slave, and you had to be from that city state. Well, now in America, it's very different. So let's think about that for a second. If you're in America, you can vote if you are what? And the answer is 18 years of age, a legal US citizen, either you're born here or you become naturalized to become a citizen, and not incarcerated, not in prison. Now, there are two states, I know Maine is one of them, that allow people who are in prison to vote, but all other states differ in terms of can you vote after you're in prison or not, and how long does that take, and things like that. But really, this is pretty broad, and this is great. This is what's wonderful about America, that so many people do have the right to vote. So pretty cool. So if you're looking at the questions for online, what patterns do you see as you review what happens with voting rights over time? As time goes on, what do you see happening with who can vote in America? That's kind of the question there. So our last section is the Greek court system and trial by jury. Trial by jury, which we have today, this idea that when you go and you're on trial, you have people who decide if you're guilty or not, and not a judge. In the American Revolution, people were really upset with this because we didn't have trial by jury. And so if you committed a crime, you go before the judge. And if the judge was, you know, kind of a crummy guy and he was not interested in what legal things were happening, he might declare you guilty even though you're not. What trial by jury does is it takes that out of the judge's hands. Now, a jury of your peers, people who live in your community, will decide if you're guilty or not based on evidence. And so it's a pretty good thing. It's a safeguarding society we want. United States connection, we obviously have this as well. The difference is the numbers. In ancient Greece, it was 201 people in a jury. In the United States, it is, anybody know? 6 to 12 people. So we have a very small jury considered to compare to ancient Greece. So think about, you know, what are the advantages of having trial by jury? Why is it a good thing? And why do we like to have it in the United States? So that's what we got for the notes, ladies and gentlemen. If you have questions, as always, contact me or your teacher if it's not me, and we'll make sure we can help you out. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you later.